Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Recently, we've come across a lot of information, a great deal of information, that poses a question, a big problem for parents today is sex education. What can be done about it? Well, there's several avenues to take in trying to come up with suggestions, advice, or recommendations for parents. One method seems to be to pour gasoline on the fire. That seems to be what a lot of people are doing. Well-intentioned sometimes, but I get very disappointed when I see some of the programs being put on in both parochial and public schools. A bad situation being made worse by orchestrating something that I don't know where somebody comes out of sometime, where they got these ideas, that I find that most well-intentioned teachers, they have to go along sometimes doing things, but most of them really don't believe this sort of thing. They seem not to. It gets worse. I have some specific suggestions, yes. One of them, come on, parents, let's take responsibility for what goes on with our children. We have the responsibility anyway, so we might as well take charge. You do not have to let your child get exposed to all sorts of things. You know, I'm thinking of a case down in Oswego County where parents objected very strenuously to a teacher using a certain technique. They took the child out. The parents were taken to court. The court ruled that the parents were wrong. The children were taken away from the parents temporarily. But the community rose up in arms, so to speak. Parents got the children back, and the teacher was fired later. But here was the technique that was being used. And it's been used right here locally. I know for certain. I've had parents come talk to me about it. And when I say locally, I'm not talking about Shazy School necessarily. I'm talking about schools in the North Country. The blunt blitz approach. Try to get children to identify all the words pertaining to sex. They're usually told, don't worry about spelling, put down any words you've ever heard of. And so they try to get students to become less sensitive to talking about certain things. Well, sometimes these very words are the things that the parents don't want the children talking about. They've avoided very carefully. And I think parents have a right to screen what they want their children to learn and don't learn. I think that's logical. Sometimes these words have meanings that are over the kid's head. They don't need to learn things. You know, I've been down the road a few times. I've taught sex education, yes. I was even backed into the corner in my doctoral studies and was told that if I wanted my doctorate degree at a certain time from a certain university, it was Florida State University, that I also had to take an internship in sex education. Very few people have had one. I don't necessarily recommend it. I had to take it. But I learned a lot of the tricks of the trade and basically how these things come about and why they come about. Sometimes the sex educators are talking to children because of their own ideas, not the children's ideas. Timing is so important. A teachable moment is when a child wants to learn something. But the parents remain responsible for that youngster. And timing has to be based on when the child wants to learn certain things or needs to learn because the child feels a need, not because sometimes a teacher says it's time. I remember one time I thought I was doing such a great job with one of my own sons. Oh, I thought I had it. I made a mistake on timing. I asked the youngster, well, is there a question you'd like to ask now? And the lad had sat very politely listening to me, but when I asked him if it was something he wanted to ask, he said, yes, can I have my ice cream now? It was just not the time. What I thought was the time was not what he thought was the time. He wasn't particularly interested. All parents will run into that sort of thing. You know, children have different stages and different ages they go into. And it's been very important. One of Freud's good ideas, he had a lot of ideas, some of them are kind of weird, but one of his good ideas is that children go through stages, and there is a stage called latency in which they don't really want to get involved sexually. Now, Freud made a mint of money talking about sex. But he also said there was an age in children's lives when basically they are asexual. They're not sexual beings. Sure, they're boys and girls, but they're not interested in the opposite sex. And sometimes teachers come along and want to teach a youngster something that's just out of time, like jumping into quantum physics before a youngster even knows how to use a pry bar. Some things need to come first. That's important. There are some principles. Each child is unique and deserves to be treated that way. And deserves to be respected for being different. Sex education should have a definite moral standard. See, sex is a moral issue all over the world, throughout history, throughout time, in every society. Therefore, to try to teach sex education without a moral basis is simply wrong. And that's basically the approach of the public school approach. And unfortunately, some parochial schools. Moral problems have to have moral solutions. And where somebody got the idea, I know where they got it, they're following a secular humanistic idea that you can have education without a moral basis, and if you try to have education about moral problems without bringing in morality, it contributes to the problem. Makes the problem worse. Sex education must teach control and restraints in every society. We're not a bunch of animals. We're not a bunch of characters that run up and down the street and respond to simply hormones and chemicals. Children have to be taught restraint. That's part of the sex education. And it's sometimes called teaching chastity. That's great. Chastity is living a pure life. That's not going to hurt anybody in any society anywhere in the world. To live a pure life according to the norms and values of that society. We also have to have sex education, as I mentioned, dispensed in stages. You don't dump it all at once. Kids aren't interested in it. Kids see sex all around them. They see gender. They see things, but they're not interested in it. They may not have an interest at all in some of the things that go on. At different age, they may become very interested in some things that go on around them. You think about the differences in different cultures. Children do a pretty good job if they're taught in the families. Children learn. We don't have to worry about that. Children need to be taught in stages. For example, there's a remote stage that sex education way before anybody's interested in sex as such, sexual activity, in terms of genital activity. Sexual activity can be as simple as acting like a boy or a girl. Remote stage, they're going to learn it anyway. Children come equipped to learn. They're good at it. That's what children do best. They're going to learn. So why not teach them in stages? Then there's the proximate stage. Kids are young, growing, teenagers, getting to be teens. Well, what they need to know may be a little different. When the hormones start flowing, kind of like sap in a tree, isn't it? Well, they need to be taught other things. And then there's a stage where it's immediate, preparation for marriage and family. There's not anything wrong with teaching sex education in reference to marriage and the family. That, I think, is where it should be. That is not the approach that most programs today follow. They follow a program of teaching sex for sex sake, based on the 4 standards. Double standard, they're trying to do away with it, but it's there. The standard of abstinence, very few places are really teaching abstinence. Sex with affection, they're teaching that, and sex even without affection. In other words, sex for sex sake. When you think about the word affection, it means feelings, and if you can imagine trying to teach young people sex without feelings, or that sex without feelings may be all right. See, that's the humanistic approach. It's situational ethics. Situational ethics is taught in schools regularly, that if you decide to do something and you've really thought about it and it's right for you, it's right. That's situational ethics. Well, parents don't follow situational ethics. Most of the time, the parents say, no, you may think it's right, but it isn't right. And sometimes parents feel hard-pressed to try to explain why something is not right or wrong, or that it is right or wrong. But so what? Parents don't have to have all the answers. I don't know very many parents who can answer all the science questions. Most of them don't feel embarrassed just because they can't answer all the science questions. Perhaps they haven't even had a course or studied it. But parents have the feeling, and they tend to know what's best for their own children. That we need to emphasize. That we need to really recognize. That's what's important, and continues to be important. It always will be important. If we can get parents who aren't afraid to talk to their children because somebody with a fancy degree somewhere has certain kinds of information, we can get the parents to talk on a rather simple basis, how they feel, convey their feelings, restraint, to the children, help the children feel and act on the restraint. Then I think we'll have a much better situation. I think it was only yesterday that I saw something in print, I forgot now, maybe it was U.S. News and World Report, showing that the United States is leading all the nations of the world that record this information in out-of-wedlock pregnancies. I believe it was 47 per 1,000 in girls 14 to 19. It was about 10 times higher than some of the other nations. And we have sex education programs that are supposed to do all sorts of things. Well, they're not working. We need to teach people in keeping with what they can understand and with their moral development. We need to make a rather simple assumption that there are moral restraints. There are things that are good for people and things that are bad for people. Rather simple. Now you may say, well, who's to determine that? I think the parent should. See? The parent has the right and the obligation and responsibility. So why not put the decision making right there with the people who have the right, the duty, and responsibility for what happens? I don't think you're going to find very many people who would say it can be done better by someone. What do they mean better? What do children need to know about sex? If you are trying to think about all this condomania that's going on, people becoming maniacal about the condoms, that has not proven to be effective in much of anything. And it has proven, though, I think, very clearly to have contributed a great deal to a breakdown in morality. It's strange to hand somebody a toy and then say, don't play with it. You expect it to happen. And some of the research findings of the people who promote this more than any others are now admitting that it hasn't worked. It hasn't worked. It's not calculated to work. And some of us didn't think it worked to start with. We were very much opposed to it. Sex education is a very serious question, a very serious issue. Parents are responsible for it. It should remain so. If you don't like what a school is doing, you have a right to take a child out of the program. And, you may be fussed at. So what? I remember one time I took one of my daughters out of a school, not around here, this was in Texas, so I'm not talking about any local people. Took one of my daughters out of school, and the superintendent called me up and said, "Do you know you're subject to a daily fine for every day you willfully keep the child out of school?" And I said, "Yes, I'd thought about that, but I think I'll counter suit. If you want to fine me, I'm going to file suit because you're not teaching. And I'm sending the child to school, compulsory education, for the purpose that the child will be taught. And you're not teaching. So when you decide to start teaching, great. Child will go back to school." He said, "We'll see what we can do." And indeed, beautiful arrangement was made. Everybody was happy. Situation was handled, but I did not like what was going on. And stated it, acted on it. Well, sometimes we don't have that liberty. Right now, people are caught up, see. They're afraid to take a child out of school. What does that mean? It means somebody has to stay home from work to take care of the child? Well, that wouldn't be such a bad thing, would it? That's why most people are afraid to do anything. The consequences, the spill out, the spillover, the ramifications. So parents today, unfortunately, become doubly obligated to the school. I don't know that schools any better off. Most schools don't want to give breakfast programs and lunch programs and after-school programs. That's not why most people went to college and studied a long time to become teachers. But that's what schools have been turned into. Well, have I harped long enough on that? I think so. This is Dr. John Middleton, Family Life in the North Country. Have a good day. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton, and this is Family Life in the North Country. Start off with today, I had a question, because there's been so much talk about these things lately. It says, can step families be happy? Well, very simple, quick answer is, of course they can be happy. Problems that most step families have is that they're not clear on who's supposed to do what. For example, if a stepfather comes into the family, what's he supposed to do about the children? Is he part of the discipline? Or if a stepmother comes into the family, is part of her job supposed to be discipline the children? Or what are the children supposed to do? So, the easiest way to solve the problems in step-parents, children are old enough, is to have a conference. Have a huddle, get together, talk it over. What's expected? I know a man right now, he's, as far as I can tell, he's doing everything he knows how to do to be a good stepfather. And what he's doing, nobody could fault him. Just one thing wrong with it. The way he's doing it doesn't please the stepchildren. Now, they're out of step, they're out of pace, they're out of balance. They're not wrong and he's not wrong. But they're not in gear, so to speak. And, you can try very hard to do something, but if what you're trying to do isn't what people want you to do, that's sort of like marriages, isn't it? Sometimes that can lead to a great deal of difficulty. Here's another question. When do children start learning? A lot of things about children, particularly on television these days, about how children get their impressions, how they can learn. I've listened to a lot of educators talk about when children start learning, and I've heard them talk about teaching children to learn. It's always been my position, and I think it's certainly the correct one. At least I agree with it. If I agree with it, that says something, doesn't it? But children start learning from the beginning. For example, brainwave patterns. Brainwave patterns is one indication that at least the brain is functioning. Brainwave patterns can be determined as early as 49 days after conception. That's pretty early, isn't it? Now, I wouldn't even want to guess what the children are thinking or what they're learning at that particular time. But the brain is functioning and the children are learning. So whatever goes on around them, they're just like a blotter. They're going to pick it up, they're going to learn it, they're going to make something out of it. And when you hear people talking about teaching children to learn, well, maybe they're teaching them to learn something different or learn a new way or something. Well, but they come pre-programmed to learn. I ran across an interesting book the other day that has some sayings in it, and I thought I would share them with you. Rather quick, rather easy, and they pertain, of course, to family life in a way. They're from Michael Levine of the Levine Communications out of Hollywood. And the first one he says is, you're doing something right if people are copying you. Well, that's only partially true, isn't it? Because people will copy a bad example also. And some people just delight in copying. But it's a good one if you're doing something you think is right. Then people copy. Well, maybe that's important. But it reminds me a little bit about how people will stand in line. Well, I haven't seen this in a long time, and some of you much too young to even know about it, but back in World War II, people stood in lines for everything. And oftentimes they didn't even know what they were standing in line for, but a line would form, and it was something being rationed, so people would stand in line afraid they'd miss out on something. Well, I think that's sort of like copying. Here's another saying. Extraordinary people are most often just ordinary people with extraordinary determination. I like that one. I used to think that only the smart people were the ones who succeeded. And then I got to looking around a little bit deeper, and I found that a lot of smart people weren't succeeding as much as ordinary people with a whole lot of determination. And I like that one. Here's another one. We must train ourselves not to see the world just through our own eyes. That's very important for parents and families. As parents, we tended to see the world just the way we wanted to see it. And to really be a good parent, or a good manager, a good neighbor, whatever, we need to be able to see the world in the other person's eyes. And here's one. I heard this the other day from a city firefighter, but it's also in this book. A Plattsburgh city fireman told me that he saw this on the Georgia Pacific signboard down on Route 9. So the trick is to find a career that you would do for free if you had the opportunity. And he changed it around a little bit and said he saw that one day and he hasn't worked a day in his life since. Everything he's done has been for fun when he became a city firefighter. But it is a very important message. I've had that opportunity. All my professional career, I've done what I like to do. And people talk about being bored or something else. I know what they're saying, but I really don't have a feeling for it because I like what I do. I do what I like. I'm very fortunate. Here's another saying out of the book. The job of a manager is not to do everything. It's to make sure that every task gets done. I see a lot of people running around trying to do everything. We see these super moms today, dual career family, both parents working. The mother is trying to make sure that everything in the household gets done, everything is done right. She feels a little bit guilty about going out to work sometimes, and so she tries to compensate and do more of the housework. Well, a good manager is somebody who gets things done through people. That's the way I learned it first. They don't try to do everything. And some of the families need to do that. I see families where the parents work hard in the homes, outside the homes, and children don't do anything. They're sitting around watching television. Couch potatoes. I think it'd be better in family life if people had chores and they had tasks. A lot of people are paying children these days if they do anything. They call it an allowance, but an allowance should be something that is there. But if you're going to hire somebody to do something, well, call it what it is. If they don't do anything, don't pay them. I'm not particularly in favor of hiring children to do things. I think family life, we ought to all work together. That'd be my recommendation. We all work for the same goals. We don't all do the same thing. Here's another saying from the Levine Communications, is that the only job security in the world is to be more talented tomorrow than you are today. Well, keep learning. That's the idea behind that. I like it. Research studies show that even the brain grows more, if we can put it that way. Actually, nerve cells can be determined to be expanding when the person is challenged. So we all need challenges, and we all need to be developing more and more talents. Here's another one out of the book. Often get into this with counseling and psychotherapy. It says nothing is more stressful than trying to be different from who you are. I often run across that. I ask people, well, who do you want to be? What is it you're trying to be? Wherever we go, we take ourselves with us, and there's only one of us, so why not be ourselves? Whatever I may try to do, I can play many different roles, but whatever role I'm in, I'm there too. The same as anybody else. People put on airs and they try sometimes so hard to be something that they're not. And most people see through it pretty quickly. Here's another one. A pessimist is somebody who complains about the noise when opportunity knocks. Yeah, I like that one. And here's another one. It says, as a leader, you must constantly change the definition of winning. Keep moving the goals. Well, I used to hear it when I was in university, that a good professor was one who always gave the same exams and kept changing the answers. Means same thing. Maybe that we learn more, we expect more, so last year's answers are not quite adequate for this year. So we need to keep trying a little bit harder. Well, so much for Levine's book. Here's a question came in rather seriously the other day. It said, Dr. Middleton, I've been to a number of counselors and so-called psychotherapists, and what do you think would help me if the others haven't? You get a call like that, it's interesting. It reminds me of a course I kept failing in college called mind reading. I never did pass that course, and but I have an answer for the question, and the question is perhaps change an attitude. When we try something and we work at it, and we're very diligent, we've made an honest effort and it doesn't work, maybe we need to change perspectives. I've seen some problems in counseling and psychotherapy over the years. They weren't psychological. People were coming for help for something that wasn't the problem. I was reviewing a record the other day that a woman was referred to me for a panic disorder. Okay, I worked on that a little bit, and then I got to thinking, that's not what the problem is. I referred her to a physician. She had a medical problem. He referred her back. We worked with that a little bit. Part of the medical problem was taken care of, and then I got that feeling again that there's something else here. Went on to another problem, physical problem. Had a tumor. All this time, and she came to me after being through several other counselors and psychotherapists, and she had a whole series of medical problems. She's doing great today. But the benefit was not through counseling. The benefit, I think, was primarily through medicine. You know, when somebody feels that they've tried everything, they don't know which way to turn, they're at the end of the rope, well, the advice is to turn around. You'll see that you're at the beginning, you're going in a new direction, and what that means is sometimes it helps us to change an attitude. What is an attitude? An attitude is the way we tend to look at something. It's the way we tend to view things. We have a certain bias sometimes. Sometimes we have a prejudice. We tend to see things, in a rather constricted view. And oftentimes, all counseling does is to help a person expand the viewpoint, to look at something a little differently sometimes. That's certainly what happens in consultation, not infrequently. Someone may say all sorts of things, this is the problem, and I just want a little help. In consultation, that's what it is. It's not a long-term development. Well, have you tried this? Or have you looked at it from this perspective? You know, the most frequent problem is that people haven't looked at their own resources. I tend to be negative. In other words, when a person has made an effort, worked hard, most of the time they haven't been fair to themselves and looked to their own resources. Sometimes all one needs to ask is, what did you do the last time a problem like this came up? How did you handle it before? And for some people, that's all they need is a trigger, and they say, oh yes, and they start looking and seeing things in a little different way. And they see that they have been successful before. See, most people are successful. Most people have done things right most of their life. They need to keep reminding themselves that most things in the world are that way. I'm Dr. John Middleton. It's Family Life in the North Country. Have a good day. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Start off today with a rather involved question. But it's a question that so many times people ask in a discussion. What is the main function of the family today? You know, we hear about the families going out of style, all sorts of things. Well, there was a study by Harrivan's, Themes in Historical Development of the Family. He came up after a good study, and he said the family today is primarily a coordinator of resources. Well, that sounds pretty simple, but I think it's terrible. If that's what family life has become today, a coordinator of resources, and you certainly see people running around trying to put their resources together, but I think the real needs of the family, a basic dozen. What the family does, the functions of the family, I think, boil down to 12 things. For example, the economic support, providing for the basic necessities, okay. Teaching the skills of personal care, of course. Maintaining a physical and mental health, of course. Primary educator and socializers, better be, for the parents teach the children, they're the primary teachers, teach the children how to socialize, and I'm well aware that some parents don't do that. We can see it all the time. Teaching and providing discipline. Discipline. That's a word that's kind of going out of style, isn't it? But it's certainly needed. I watched a parent the other day with an 18-month-old child, and the 18-month-old child was doing exactly what it wanted to do. And the parent said, it's too early to discipline. I thought, how wrong can you be? An 18-month-old child has already had maybe 2 years of learning. And that child has already learned a great deal. I'm not sure when that parent wants to start disciplining the child, because the children learn. They're going to learn. Now, what is the child learning? Well, we need parents who feel secure enough in themselves that they set the limits, that they guide, they help the child to learn what it's supposed to learn. Another one is instilling a motivation for survival. We inspire children. We give children a reason for life. And our whole theme of our family, a raison d'etre. Why are we living, and why do we do what we do? And of course, a family should be involved in individual and group recreation. Too many families aren't having fun. They're racing down the road. They're trying to coordinate these services, be in 100 different places at once, and this child's over here, and that one's over there, and this one's over here, and the family's over here, and father's over there, and mother's over there, and they rush in and have an instant ready-made meal. That's not the way to rear families. You know, another function of the family, and as far as I know, nobody's really tried to take over this one, that's bearing children, producing children. Oh, I know there are a few experimental labs, but there's so few children. Primarily the family. How about the family in providing gender and personal identity? You are a man, you are a woman, you are a boy, you are a girl. This is what men and women do. I'm well aware there are a lot of people running around beating drums and blowing horns and saying that it doesn't matter anymore. I don't agree. Another function of the family is to take care of the people who are dependent, disabled, elderly. How about an infant? An infant is certainly dependent. Too many families today are getting out of that, aren't they? They're taking a child to some kind of child care center. I started to say daycare, but somebody keeps correcting me when I say daycare. No, we don't take care of the days, we take care of children. Well, I think the family would be the best place, and that is a function of the family. And then the 12th one is to protect the family as a unit from whatever would be destructive for the family. Those 12 things are important, and they haven't changed. Any society in the world throughout history, those are basically what families really are doing. I'm well aware that in technological societies, as the study mentioned that I cited, society, government, different kinds of governmental programs take over a lot of them. But the functions are there, and they can be done best in the families. Well, here's another question. It says, how can we make our marriage better and more satisfying and producing more happiness for both of us? Not an uncommon question for a marriage counselor. A rather simple answer to start with is to have a clear idea of what you expect. What do you expect your spouse to do or not do? Sometimes it's easiest to figure out, well, what I don't want and what I do want. We change along the way. You know, you may have perfect agreement this year, and we change. It doesn't mean somebody has a problem. That doesn't mean that what was satisfying 5 years ago and isn't today means somebody has a problem. That's just life. Things change. But here's some basic guidelines. Look at your spouse closely. When's the last time? Know the color of his eyes or her eyes? Look closely and see the real person there. The real person. So often I suggest to people that, well, they're right in front of me and they're reluctant to even look at each other. How about listening to your spouse, not only just with your ears, but with your heart? What is the person really wanting you to understand? What does your partner really want you to understand? What does the partner want you to care about? Do you know? Well, you should. How about resolving problems by dialoguing, talking, rather than confrontation? I listen to people sometimes saying, you always do this, you always do that, you never do this. People go on and on that way. The always and nevers. Which is probably not accurate. Most people aren't that consistent. But I also see people putting the other one down. Saying, well, we wouldn't have this problem if you hadn't done something. It's your fault, yeah? Yeah, I hear that sort of thing. How about avoiding nagging? You know, men are just as big a nags as women. They don't like to say so, but I'll make that statement. How about building on each other's strengths instead of the weakness of the person? This is what we can do. This is your strength. This is what I like about you. Why not tell the person that? Most of us are much easier to say what we don't like than what we do like. How about being patient with your own imperfections and your partner's imperfections? So, may not be perfect, but who among us is perfect? I haven't met one yet. We'll have perfect marriages just as soon as we have perfect people. And I'm not holding my breath. How about a sense of humor? And I'll relax a little bit. Most people tend to take themselves much too seriously. Sense of humor, a joke at the right time, the right kind of joke, can put a lot of things in perspective. Really think about your partner. Where's this person coming from? What kind of family background? What are all these things? And look at the value. The value of the person to you. Look at all the things that this person has done for you. And what you said you were going to do for her or him that you haven't gotten around to yet. Who has the bigger debt? Who owes the other one more? Yes, we tend to stack up a lot of debts, don't we? But we think of the other person owing us most of the time. We tend to forget what we owe the person. And you know, being able to be secure in knowing that the other person is there, what the other person is going to do, certain feeling of security, but that's also taking the other one for granted. But we're never supposed to act like we take the other one for granted. But we're very carefully avoiding taking for granted, while at the same time let's bask in the security of knowing that the person is there. Now, are we always there? Are we as dependable? Let's hope so. Let's hope so. And if not, make it so. You know, we have our obligation to live up to the marriage vows, and most of us took the same marriage vows. Do you remember? Promise to love. What does that mean? What does it mean to your partner? How does your partner want you to express love? Are you expressing it in a way that it's being asked, always being appreciated? Have you even told your partner how you want love to be expressed? Sometimes people will talk about anything under the sun except when it gets right down to something like that, they don't want to talk about it for some reason. They go, well, well, No, I find that so often people don't know. They need to express it and say how they want it. Some people like love in a square package with a ribbon around it. Some like a roll. Some like it different ways. But we promise to love. We promise to honor. That means to respect. And we promise to cherish, and that means to treat as valuable. How about just those three things in the marriage vows? Most of the problems come along when people violate just one of those three. You remember most people got married in church, didn't they? Why? They got married in church because for some reason, well, it's a convenient place, it's sort of the way to do it, but there was also religion involved. Don't forget to put some religion there. And when you took those sacred vows, or holy vows, you had God in it, so don't be afraid to put God in the marriage. Well, we have so many different kinds of problems coming up today as if they're brand new. The problems aren't new. We have different ways they're expressed. We have all kinds of media throwing things at us. And some of it's very good, and some of it's not worth letting into your house. And we're looking to see, well, what are these children learning? I was listening to someone last night, and I mentioned that, some of the families today have difficulty about some problems with the children, and the parent came back immediately and said, I'm one of those parents who was reared with secular humanism being thrown at us all the time in school. I was surprised because most people don't know what secular humanism is. I was pleased that the person had that much insight. Secular humanism. What in the world is that? Well, that means that humanism means that the human mind is believed to be all-powerful. There is no room in the world for God or any kind of religious belief. That everything is situational, that whatever you want to do is all right as long as you're really conscientious in deciding what you want to do. Situational ethics. In other words, there's no black and white, everything is gray. It's atheistic, and it believes in change for change's sake. Now those are the three characteristics of humanism. There are others, but those are the basic ones, and so many people get caught up thinking, well, yes, humanist, this is for human beings. This is for humanity. It is. It is for humanity, but it's also for something that says humanity first and always, and nothing else matters. If I decide to do something, then that's right. It doesn't matter so much if it hurts you. If it pleases me and those that I'm involved with, okay, that makes it right. That's a humanistic approach. And parents today who have been taught this sort of thing, all kinds of things. And this is a whole new topic, and we'll talk about that next time probably. About the sex education programs today. It is a very deep subject, a very important subject, and so many parents think they're not qualified. Well, let's talk about that another time. And until then, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Have a good day. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. As I mentioned on the last program, it's going to take up sex education today. I'm sure everybody thinks he's a specialist or she's a specialist in sex education until it comes time to start teaching the children. And the primary question that I hear from time to time from parents is, what can be done about it? You know, I've had mothers call me and make appointments just to talk about sex education that their children are being exposed to. I've even had several mothers together come along and want to know about these things. Well, there are several avenues in sex education, and some of the programs are like pouring gasoline on a fire. Too often that's what's happening in schools. They're well-intentioned. You may think, well, what kind of expertise do I have? Maybe I better qualify myself. My doctorate is in family life education, marriage and family counseling. I've also had, as part of that, internship in sex education itself. So I'm not altogether naive. And being a great-grandparent, I've been down the road, or sometimes in marriage classes, marriage training, people say, you know, what an old goat like that know about sex? Well, what does an old goat like that know about sex? If you're as old as I am, maybe you've seen or heard about most everything. I keep saying that, and then next year, what do you know, I learn something new. But back to the sex education and parents, very seriously. Too many parents count themselves out of the picture. They say, well, I don't know how to do it. I don't know how to teach the child. You're already teaching the child. You can't help but teach a child. Sex education starts just as soon as that youngster has found out that there are men and women, that mama is different from daddy. That's sex education already. Sexuality, the total being of gender. So, if you're already doing it anyway, what are you doing? If you like who you are as a woman or as a man, that by itself is a very good educational background for the child. If you don't like who you are, you're always quarreling, crabbing, and fussing about who you are as a person, that teaches a child. That's sex education. Too many parents think that they're supposed to have some technical information, some magic books or some kind of training to be sex educators. That's not true. You think about all the vast numbers of people in the world today, and how many of them had sex education? And yet, they know enough. They know enough to get by. You don't have to have a course in quantum physics just to use a pry bar. And this is basically the way sex education is. I'm convinced that the sex educators themselves have become over-intellectualized, have become much too involved in technical details. Some of the programs that I've been aware of have used the blunt blitz approach, and they want the children to know all the dirty words. And they give tests even. Can you imagine a classroom in a test and say to the children, write down all the dirty words you can think of or ever heard of, and you don't have to worry about spelling. We don't take off for spelling, and the one who writes the most makes the highest grade. That has occurred. It's supposed to be to desensitize the children so that they'll be free to talk about anything. Kids in school then are being asked to say things and write things on paper they're not allowed to say at home. That causes a problem. That's one of the problems in sex education. I know of a school, and I went to it in part of a sex education program where there was a joint effort, other people involved, even one of the popular agencies. They wanted to do sex education with a proviso that the children were not allowed to say anything to the parents about what was said or what was going on. I don't think that's reasonable. I don't think it's fair. I think any time you separate the parents, it's plain wrong. And I think I can prove it. Sex education has to go in stages. There's certain principles to be followed. Each child is unique. Each child needs to be respected. And not every child is interested in the so-called technical, sophisticated world. And somebody wants to start right now with me, it's great-grandchildren age, but they want to start showing me that my child needs to know how to put a condom on a banana. That's crazy. It always is. Always was. Sex education has to have clear moral dimensions. Sex everywhere in the world is a moral question. It's associated with morality. Therefore, when you try to divide morality from sex, it's artificial. And that's the intention of most sex education programs in schools, is to take the morality away from the sexual behavior. That's a major problem, because it teaches the children there is no right or wrong answer. Sex education, to be done right, has to teach restraint. I even heard one time saying that education itself was learning how to inhibit ourselves. And it was not talking about sex education. They're talking about education in general. One of the famous educational philosophers. We have to learn restraint. We're not a bunch of animals. We're not a bunch of dogs running around on the street that if the hormones are right, the chemicals are right, then boom, copulate. No, that's not what it's supposed to be, but that's what they're training. Anybody in his or her right mind who thinks that you can hand out condoms and say don't use them, that you can educate people, so-called, expose them to all sorts of different things, and then say don't. No. Expect them then not to try it? That's foolish. Sex education really needs to be dispensed in stages. Rather simple. As I said on an earlier program, sex education starts the moment the child starts recognizing the differences in sexes, that there are men and women. Well, that's a long ways away from becoming a parent. If we just stop and look around the world, practically everything around us is involved with reproduction. What did you have for breakfast? What did you have for lunch? What did you have for dinner? Probably you had things that were part of the reproductive process. Eggs, flowers, the germs, the seeds. Just think about all the vegetables you eat. Most of what we eat are the seeds, having to do with the reproduction of plants. It's much more around us than most of us think about, and it's such a natural thing that practically all of society is involved with reproduction, the things of beauty. Why can't we just fold that right into the very normal process? That's the way it's done in so-called primitive people. Children don't get all hung up on sex. They're not being screened about a lot of things. And I'm not suggesting that people have intercourse in front of the children, but if it's carried on as a natural act, the children, of course, they're going to learn in steps and in patterns. They're going to learn what they need to know. I remember one time I was doing what I thought was a remarkably good job with one of my sons. I thought, well, I've really done a good job on this sex education thing, and so I said, is there any question you'd like to ask now? And he said, yes, can I have my ice cream now? Well, it brought me up pretty sharp. He wasn't really interested in that time. It told me that what I was interested in, he wasn't interested in, and that's the way with most of it. It has to be time. Well, here's another question. Says Dr. Middleton, my wife keeps nagging me about getting an insurance plan for long-term care, nursing homes. What do you think? Well, people who can afford to buy that kind of insurance don't need it. Very simple, clear answer. Only 1% of the people go into nursing homes before age 65, and the average age on going into a nursing home for those people who need it is 85. And most of the insurance claims are for less than a year. So if you put all that in perspective, I'm well aware that some insurance companies are really making a pitch to sell this sort of stuff. I get them too. But if you can afford that kind of insurance, you probably don't need it. Because the average person is less than a year in a nursing home. And the average person doesn't go into a nursing home. That was a very popular myth a few years ago. I used to go around and do a lot of talks, Tri-County Council on Aging, Clinton County, Franklin, Essex County. And I've been a national delegate to the White House Conference on Aging back in '60. I was involved with studying old people and working with them way back then. That was a good while back, 36 years ago. Well, most people had a mistaken idea that most old people were in nursing homes. I'd go around here, right here in Clinton County, and say, just sort of an introduction to giving programs, how many people are in nursing homes? And so often people come back and say, 50% of the people, 50% of the old people. No, very small percentage. Most old people are not in nursing homes. They don't need it. So the answer to the question that came in about that is, tell your wife you're going to take the money that you would buy on that insurance, you're going to invest it in good stocks, and you're going to take, both of you I hope, take a nice trip and let your children worry about their inheritance while you're enjoying yourself on a big vacation. It's not considered good investment. That's not just my opinion. That's also the opinion of Robert Hunter, who is the insurance specialist with the American Consumer Federation of America. Here's another question. It says, what do you think about euthanasia? I think that'll kill you. And that's exactly what it is. Any action that is taken to shorten your life, or any action that's taken not to give service that intends to shorten your life, I don't think it's right. I don't think it's reasonable. I'm well aware that there are governmental programs right now. I'm well aware of the politics behind it. To save money, that if old people would just simply go off and die quietly, then young people would have more money. They'd have more inheritance. They wouldn't spend the money in hospitals and a few in nursing homes. Long-term care is rather expensive, even if it's given at home. So, who would benefit? Well, I'm well aware that that is a major social problem, but it's not justified. Anything which shortens a life, intentionally shortens somebody's life, has to be considered wrong. Here's another question. It says, how important is it to keep promises to children when the thing isn't important itself? I think it's important to keep promises to children, and if you can't learn to trust people in little things, something is not so important, you can't trust them with big things, or shouldn't be able to. Too many parents say, well, it's all right. I hear and listen to parents who seem to just make all kinds of promises and think nothing at all about breaking them. I think that's wrong. I don't think that's the way to teach children. If you make promises, keep it. Sure, there are times when it's impossible to keep a promise, but go back to the children or the child and say so. Say what the circumstance is that changed it. Set another time or whatever the promise was about. But learn to keep your promises. Maybe it'd be beneficial if you didn't make so many. be more careful about them. If you intend to keep them, then you're going to start restraining yourself on having your promises to make. Here's another question. It says, don't the ends justify the means? Family life? No. Answer, clearly. The means have to be proper. You can't do something wrong in order to get a good end result. And that reminds me of so much of the education today, outcome-based education. Just to get everybody through school, they don't have to learn much. So they dumb it down and they lower the standards. That's not the way to run a ball game. You won't have a good team doing that, outcome-based education. You can't run sports activities that way or anything else, and we shouldn't be trying to run our academic programs that way. But too many people think it's all right. Whatever you have to do to get the results you want is all right. No, it can't go that way. Anything which is wrong, that doesn't justify the goal. Set the goals clearly, and also have every step of the way something that you're willing to live with, and say you've been doing the right thing. Until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Have a good day. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. I have an interesting question. Sometimes people find it provoking. The question comes up, and you have to think about it seriously. Is it true that homosexuality is incurable? Incurable. Well, to say incurable or curable means or implies that there's some kind of disease or sickness, doesn't it? Some people would object to that. I would think a better word would be abnormality or disorder rather than a disease. Abnormal, and even though some people will object to that, abnormal because of this definition. If some part of the body is used in a way it's not meant to be, in other words, a basic function used in a different way, then that's abnormal. That's rather simple. So, the answer to the question, no, I do not think it is incurable. I think that some people have the disorder, they have the pattern of behavior, and there's very great deal of evidence coming in that yes, indeed, this can be changed. Now, for some reason, for several years, people thought no, and still it's popularly stated that once anybody finds themselves involved in homosexual activity, that they can't change it. Well, that's mostly propaganda. We've known it for centuries. Yet it continues to be popular. For example, here in the North Country, we have many people who work in prisons. And they certainly are aware of it, that there's a great deal of homosexuality in prisons. Yet outside the prisons, most of these people certainly are not homosexual. It's just, what we used to call institutional homosexuality. That was a long time ago when we used that term. 40, 50 years ago, that was a term that was being used. It wasn't thought to be particularly abnormal even. Any time that men or women are incarcerated or find themselves circumstances for very long periods of time away from the opposite sex, well, they'll try to find some other way of expressing their sexuality. Enough said about that? I hope so. Let's move it along. A lot of information's been coming in lately. People have been asking, what's really happening about the crime with boys and girls? We hear about crime, and of course it's political right now. Excuse me, but here's what's really different. That girls, teenage girls, are involved in crime much more than they used to be. Much more. They're doing things that we used to think were strictly for the boys, the men, such as assault, robbery, arson, disorderly conduct. Sure, women have always been disorderly, the same as men have, but they typically didn't involve themselves in certain kinds of crime. Anybody who studies criminology, reads in this field, knows that there were big differences in how crime seemed to have been reported. What's happening now? We've seen well over 100% increase in crime among young girls, young women. And it's interesting and it's sad. It's sad because it represents another breakdown of standards that we used to have. Is it due to divorce? Is it due to broken families? Is it due to welfare? Is it due to poverty? Well, it depends on your political frame of reference, how you might like to answer the question. But I think the real answer, the best answer, is it's related to a breakdown in values. And I don't care what political party you may want to favor on something like that. I don't think either political party or any of them, there are more than one, more than two, whatever, I think any of them are going to be hard-pressed to do anything about this change, because I don't think that's the problem. Politics only contributes and feeds on the will of the people, in a way, the will of the voters. But divorce, the breakdown in families, that's more important. And sure, you get people talking about, well, family values and that sort of thing, but now what are we really going to do about them? Women's lib movement certainly is a factor in increasing crime rates about women. I've mentioned on this program before that along with this women's lib movement, and I'm talking about the militant extreme feminists who are really out there fighting and against most things of what society says it believes in. I've mentioned to you before that the assaults and violent behavior in partnerships, for example, lesbian partnerships, is far above average. These are not the peaceful relationships that propagandists would have us believe or like for us to believe. Yes, divorce, broken families, all of these things are related. You know, children of divorce have a harder time. They tend to shy away from marriage. They tend to avoid dating. It's related to dating. And by the way, I have a pamphlet here. If anybody'd like to have one, all you have to do is send me a stamp, self-addressed stamped envelope. I'll mail it to you at your expense. You know, stamps now cost about $0.33, don't they? But I'd be happy to send this. It's called Trial Marriages for Me or Someone in My Family, Now or Later. That's something I wrote up not long ago. Be glad to send it to you. Be glad to give you one if you see me. You know, we have some problems about trying to put things together today about family life. And we're seeing more and more problems with single mothers having difficulty with their daughters. Maybe it's related to the crime. Maybe it's also related to the divorce. But for a while we were going on the assumption and looking at the evidence thinking, well, what's really involved is the absence of fathers. Well, that's a very significant factor. But we're also finding that the girl's relationship to her mother is very important, much more important than perhaps we first thought. We always took for granted that relationship to parents was important. But if a woman has a poor relationship with her own mother, what's now pretty evident is that she is likely to have poor relationships with her daughters. It gets passed along then in generations, one after the other. Fathers are notoriously absent today. It is a major problem. How many of them are gone? Where are these fathers? You just go to some plant. There's several of them around here. You go to places where people work. And you look, see who's coming to work, who's going to work. And you think about where they're going. Are they going home to their children? What's going on here? In 1960 we had, about 1 in 5 households had a father missing in 1960. Now there's a lot of racial differences here, and that has a history of its own. But 30 years later, that's doubled. That's a major difference. Again, in racial factors, in so-called minorities, 8 out of 10 children are born to a single-parent mother. That's right now, 8 out of 10. It's tragic. I think if fathers don't start thinking of themselves as responsible, we're going to see, even more problems. And I don't know where it's going. When I said a while ago, and I'll I'll divert a little bit in the history of minorities. Let's put it on the table, just straight up. History of the black family in the United States. Very briefly, they were slaves, brought over in 1619, the first ones. These people were captured. The slave masters broke up the families. That's the way they could transport them without having constant problems. They frightened them, they scared them. These people were bought and sold. The history of it, sure, they came into the Plymouth colonies first, but the history shows that the Southerners developed plantations based on slave labor and Civil War, all of that. After the Civil War, what happened? The men didn't have any place to go. See, prior to the Civil War, the typical blacks, typical Negro of the South, they had no marriage. It was the slave owner who had the option of letting his slaves marry or not. And if they married, they were still slaves, and if they married, they were subject to being sold, broken families, more like prize livestock, literally, not figuratively, literally. Chattel, the word chattel. They had the same value as cattle. For example, in a home I used to own in Austin, Texas, part of the abstract title showed that the home was bought so much money, certain kinds of property, and so many slaves. Slaves were traded. Now, this has had an impact on the black family. See, after the Civil War, in the South, there were millions of Negroes who had no ministers, no clergy. These people were not educated. Most of them had not been allowed to be educated. They were not sent to school. Basically, there were a couple of isolated cities and areas where they were schooled, New Orleans and St. Louis. But in the main, the circumstance was that the man had no role. So, what was he supposed to do? He drifted. He worked. If there was no such thing as a marriage, basically, by the way, the first slave wedding took place, performed by Cotton Mather, the first one in record, and it was not in the South, Cotton Mather, and he had the people hold hands and jump over a broomstick. That was the wedding ceremony for the first recorded wedding of slaves. And his words were, "I now pronounce you man and wife, but remember you are slaves." They jumped over the broomstick. This pattern, 1865, where there were masses of people who were suddenly freed into a situation which was rather strange. The hard-working people, well, they could get jobs, but the economy was on the bottom. If you review any history at all, you know that. And so the black males got into the pattern of drifting. And what are they doing today? Some of them are still doing that. They've never really settled down. Now, that's not an indictment of all Negroes or blacks. Of course it isn't, because you find that the middle-class black outwhites the whitey. They have stronger family values and will make greater progress as a group than the white counterparts. And there is the other group, however, the lower class, where family values are not the same. They never have been. There's no point in trying to pretend there is. There isn't any such thing as talking about a political correctness there, because they aren't the same. They never have been. And anybody who really wants to say so, I'll just suggest hasn't read, hasn't studied. And it's a serious problem. And unfortunately, the seriousness of that problem is spilling over into everybody else's society today. We're having the majority of our population is thinking less and less about fatherhood, less and less about the importance of intact families, where we have stability, we have security. Well, having said that, the question comes up, is there anything good going on in family life today? Yes, most families are two-parent. They married one time, they're taking care of their children. The children are not in difficulty, people are not on welfare. That's the situation in most families today. Well, until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Have a good one. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. And we start off today about young people. You know, recently in a supplement to the Plattsburgh Press Republican, the magazine supplement parade, there was a featured article about teenagers, teenage surveys. And basically the whole idea of this particular article was that the teens are turning a corner. Things are getting better. That 9 out of 10 of them say they don't drink or smoke. Perhaps some of you remember reading that. 7 out of 10 say that religion is important, and 6 in 10 are against premarital sex. That may surprise some people if you didn't take the time to read it, but if you go back and study, do any kind of reading in the history, those figures are not really different. You've always been able to find answers like that. Sometimes we get answers because we ask the questions, don't we? And not picking on teenagers, but adults are the same way. If you go out and do a survey and you ask somebody, well, what do you believe in? You'll get an answer. But it's also been found that that may not represent what people do. So sometimes an answer and behavior are the same. But yet these are positive signs, particularly with the drug thing and about smoking and drinking. 9 out of 10 say they don't. I think that's encouraging. About the premarital sex, that's been that way for years and years. That's not a recent change at all. 7 out of 10 saying religion is important. That's down a little bit. See, saying it's important and practicing religion are two different things. And that's, I think, something we have to keep in mind. What we're looking at though, is a group of teenagers, and this is what I got out of that survey and reading it. Maybe they're seeing the turmoil that's going on around them, and they're reaching for something more solid, more substance. And that's positive. I find that in young people, but of course the young people that I talk to, for example, in teaching religion, well, these are really self-selected young people. Their parents have encouraged them, and they're probably considered the cream of the crop in some ways, in terms of what they believe in and their own behavior. I think the biggest change that we've seen is a shift in what people consider what's important to succeed and what is success. A change in valuing the instrumental works. For example, most people say, yeah, I'd like to have a college degree, but are they willing to work, to study, to get one? There's a big difference. I'm saying, yes, I want it, the ambition, the aspiration to have a college education, but are you willing to really study to get one? To do the homework, to do the study, to really dig in. Of course, anybody who's taught school knows that there's a big difference between what people say, yes, I'd like an A, but I'm not willing to work for it. Same thing goes with a lot of other things. People say, well, yes, I want to be something, I want to have a certain job, profession, career. But when you say, okay, well, this is what it takes to get from point A to point B, there's a big difference there. We're also seeing today a lot of hedonism. Hedonism. What does that mean? It means just operating for the fun of something, to have pleasure. There isn't anything wrong in having pleasure, of course not. But suppose that's the primary goal. See, hedonism should be a reward for having done something, for having achieved, for having put your ducks in the right order, so to speak. What we're looking at today is just people who want a good time all the time. They're not really willing to wait until they've earned it, so to speak. The hedonism. You ask somebody, what do you really want out of life? To be happy. That's what those teenagers in that Parade magazine supplement said. What do you want out of life more than anything else? To be happy. Yes. What does it take? What does that mean? What do you mean to be happy? No, just to be happy. This is what they go on. Isn't that nice? Nothing wrong with wanting to be happy. Let's hope everybody's happy. Happy what? Maybe happy doing something. Happy achieving something. Happy attaining something. Happy acquiring skills, information, to build oneself, to become a better person. That also is related to happiness. Very much so. We have another one from Press Republican lately. I thought it was rather interesting. Some of you may have seen this one. It said the Humanist Survey says Americans are religious. The Humanist Survey. What is humanist? What does that mean? I'm going to guess that most people who read that article thought, well, yeah, I know, Americans are religious. But what they may not have taken the trouble to look at was to find out, who are the humanists? And why would that make news? I think it made news because the humanists are themselves not believers in religion. And I think that's why it made news. See, it's in a way saying a group of atheists do a survey and find that most people are religious. That makes the news. See, these same people as a group, doesn't mean all of them, of course, but as a group, have been going around emphasizing that we don't need religion. We don't need people believing God. People who believe in God have an impediment of some kind. They are, well, retarded in a way, because they don't believe in themselves enough. The humanists believe that the solution to any problems in the world, any problems in society, can be solved by the thinking of people. Well, putting man as the center of the universe instead of a God. Do they have a right to think that? Of course they do. A lot of people are humanists. You find them all around. They'd like to believe in God, but they also believe in being humanist. Humanist, as a philosophical thing, has three marks. I've mentioned this before. One, it's atheistic. Two, it has situational ethics. And three, it believes in change for change's sake. Those are the three basic characteristics of the secular humanist. Secular meaning non-religious, public. John Dewey, some of you recognize his name, who is considered the founder of American public education, was a principal author of the Humanistic Manifesto in 1933. John Dewey was the one who, Columbia University professor, lived into his late 90s, was really very powerful in influencing public education away from any religious connotation. And in 1973, Humanistic Manifesto number 2 was written. And it was written to complement the first one, but it set forth some very specific policies and statements, recommendations, and it had a very heavy influence in this country because it was signed, and signatures show that most of the popular people and influential people of the day signed that document. I say most. Quite a considerable number of the major thinkers. Well, having mentioned religion, here's another question that comes up because I think it's important. What part does religion play in people's lives? What function does it have? Well, let's look at it very briefly. Religion is found in all societies. If God hadn't created man, man creates God. That seems to be the pattern. And Voltaire, I think, is the one who said that first, or something like that, but it's certainly not an original thought with me. But it serves a purpose. It gives a basic morality, regardless of what religion, what society we're talking about. The religion in any particular such society, by the way, there's never been one found without religion, serves to set the basis, the foundation of morality. In other words, it's the standard of behavior. What people believe in, what they don't believe in, what people must do and must not do. Purpose of religion. People want to have limits and parameters. They want to have boundaries. They also have a need to believe in something outside of themselves, something greater than themselves. And interestingly enough, as soon as they do that, they start wanting to become their own champion of that. They want to be the masters. They want to be the ones who set the parameters or the boundaries. That seems to be the history of society, any society. In the various societies of the world, as you know, most of you would certainly recognize that some societies have many, many gods to explain ordinary sorts of things. Other societies have very few. The Judeo-Christian societies believe in one God. And the purpose, though, seems to be the same. If we look at societies as a whole, it's a motivation for survival, the purpose of religion. I don't expect that we'll ever have a society without religion. And if you were to look in a large dictionary, even the humanist, by the way, that I just mentioned, that's considered a religion, has been. Even though they don't believe in a God, they have a set of principles. And it's interesting to look at it. Here's another question, change the subject. Why do marriages break up? Marriages seem to break up because people don't have commitments. Think about it. They don't keep their marriage vows. I mentioned before, but it's worth mentioning again, that as I see people and have for quite a few years, I don't see people who have problems in marriage. It's not a product of breaking their marriage vows. In other words, every time I see couples having difficulty in their marriage, my first thought is, what part of the marriage vows are they breaking? Promise to love, to honor, to cherish, to forsake all others. Disappointments, of course. People have disappointments. You know, the idea of marriage is also present in just every society that comes to mind. Every society expects marriage. Every society expects lines, rites of passage, so that people know who's married and who isn't. There's a different set of behaviors expected for people who are married than those who aren't. People who are married have obligations to take care of the family, to provide for their children, to lend continuity to the society. People who aren't married aren't, as a group, given those chores. They aren't expected to meet the responsibilities of society quite the same way. Every society has that. Interestingly enough, it's been studied, the anthropologists say that the near universals, that is, things that are found so frequently that it's generalized that this is expected in any society. Doesn't mean there might not be an exception somewhere. Marriages are supposed to last. Marriages are supposed to produce children. And marriages are the way that people attain the greatest success. Success in whatever they may be wishing to do in the world in which they live, to benefit the world in which they live. Here's a question. Somebody asked me, said, I saw a mother punishing her child in a supermarket. What do you think about that? Well, I don't think a whole lot about it. Maybe the child needed punishment. On the other hand, maybe the mother just asked the child, what kind of cereal do you want? And the child answered, but he didn't give the right answer, so she punished. I think punishment is not the same as abuse. The person who asked the question wanted me to get into child abuse. I don't think that's the same thing. I think there's a time and place for punishment. I don't think a supermarket's a place. I don't know what circumstances might have been. Maybe it was a capital offense. Who knows? Children don't usually commit major crimes in supermarkets, but I think we have to look at people's behavior and understand what's going on with them. Just to look at it from the outside, we may not know what's going on. We may not see what is the real reason behind some of these things. So perhaps it's best not to jump to conclusions. We most often do. Oh, she shouldn't do that, or he shouldn't do that. But, children also play the system, don't they? They pick and choose what they do on the basis of what they think their parents will do. So they pick and choose to do what they think they can get by with. Human nature doesn't seem to have changed very much, does it? Until another time. I'm Dr. John Middleton. This Family Life in the North Country. Visit us again. Have a good day. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Something that perhaps a lot of you have seen lately, but it starts the question for this particular program. So, is it true that unborn children suck their thumb? Some of you may have seen these sonograms, and they're fun to look at, aren't they? Yes, the answer is yes, children suck their thumbs when they're not yet born. But here's what seems to be happening. The thumb passes the mouth, and the youngster grabs it, so to speak. Because you know that a newborn has a little trouble reaching and getting things and doing things deliberately. They learn fairly quickly, but this thumb in the mouth that you see in sonogram, most of the time that's a reflex. Same way the reflex, you put something in the child's hand and grips it. Well, speaking of children, here's another one. I've heard this one asked around lately because I guess I've been around some young mothers. When's a good time to toilet train children? Most people aren't interested in toilet training, are they? The best answer to that I know to that is when the mother's ready. I got into a friendly discussion with a mother on this question. She was assuring me that children cannot be toilet trained before a certain age because the nervous system isn't developed. She didn't want to listen to the facts that in certain societies children are toilet trained much earlier than in other societies without reference to the nervous system. For example, the women who raise children in the desert sands toilet train children very early. They make a little potty with their bare feet in the sand. The child sits on their feet like a little commode. Children are toilet trained very quickly. It was also surprising that in the South, in the lower socioeconomic black families, I'm talking about the poor black families, several years ago, 50 years ago, it was found that children typically are toilet trained before a year old. And you take these women who wear the children, so to speak. They have the children slung over the shoulder, the bush people, the people who live in the jungles. Babies are kept next to the mother practically all the time. These children are toilet trained very early too. How? Because the mother is sensitive to the child's movements, the child's struggling, and the child's grunts. You drop a child off at the daycare center 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning on the way to work, and you pick them up at 5. You're not going to see these children toilet trained very early. But the children whose mothers are with them, that's the reason I think the best answer is when the mother's ready. And there are a lot of cultural and a lot of social differences. And it's become easy with all the plastic diapers and Pampers and whatever else they're called. It's become easy. But if you had to wash those old diapers, the cloth diapers, some of you have never even seen one, but if you go back just a little while, not very many decades ago, when all diapers were cloth and they were washed, and if you had to wash diapers for a while, you were much more interested in toilet training children. Much more interested. Some of you might remember that. Made a difference. Here's a question, rather interesting and perhaps an involved question, but maybe some of you are interested. It says, what is social class? We hear about it a lot. We hear about it from time to time, and can you really explain? The question came, can you explain what social class is? Yes. Social class, you find it in every society. There are people who believe themselves to be better off than other people as a group. And groups of people then divide themselves accordingly. Not just for simplicity, say the lower, middle, and upper class. There are some distinct differences in how these people seem to relate. Interestingly, the people in the upper class take much more pride in their families. And people in the lower class may be very much involved with children and family life, but they may not know the different generations. In our society, the Western culture here, typically the lower class family may not even know the great-grandparents, even know who they were. But an upper class family, they may know 6 to 9 generations. Who was related to who was the child of whom. There's a difference in educational standards. The upper class, the true upper class in our society today, typically don't use public education. They have private education, and the people are trained and educated for social purposes, to either take control of or to be in a responsible position of other people. Not necessarily trained to work in that sense, to earn a living with their hands. True upper class has wealth. It doesn't have to earn a living. Child care is different. The upper class may have governesses and people like that to take care of children. There's a difference in the homes. They may live in ancestral homes, where the lower class is typically tenants, and they move frequently. The upper class moves very little as far as ancestral homes go. They may have a home in Florida and one in New York, something like that. Or up here, yeah, we have a lot of snowbirds too, don't we? Go south in the winter, but they wouldn't necessarily be considered upper class. Some of them may be. In the upper class, we have a great deal of control of marriage. It's important who marries whom. And this is why all the fuss and the fanfare has been going on about the British family, the royalty in the British, because we're seeing here is a breakdown. Princess Diana, all of that stuff that's been going on, Prince Charles, that's a breakdown in what's been considered to be the symbol of upper class, the aristocracy. You know, there used to be, when we studied social class in sociology courses, 9 levels. We had a lower, middle, lower, upper, lower, lower, middle, and upper middle, and a lower, upper, middle, upper, and upper. We had 9 social classes. And it was important to try to study society, if you really were going to study society as a whole, to understand the different levels, the different kinds of thinking. Upper class is a way of thinking, not necessarily money. It's true that most of the time the upper class have a great deal of money, but money itself isn't the only thing about it. It's where the money comes from. For example, some of you may remember, having studied sociology way back, there was a term called the new rich. People who acquired a great deal of money and therefore could live in the circumstances of the upper class, but they didn't think of the upper class. They didn't think of themselves that way. Remember the television program, the Beverly Hillbillies? That was a type of thing, showing the new rich. We have somebody running for president right now who's a new rich. Ross Perot. He had more money than anybody else, but he's not upper class in terms of his background. And sometimes it shows, people say, but the upper class people would look down their noses at somebody like that. But you know, I've worked with upper class people, interestingly. I worked with a woman who couldn't feed herself, but she was a member of the upper class. I could tell you the name. The name would be famous, that some of you could certainly recognize. But a member of the upper class who didn't have money. See, they often have wealth, but not money as such, spendable money. This particular woman had a lot that was worth $1 million, according to what she said. But she couldn't feed herself some days. She had wealth in intangible ways. She thought of herself as upper class. She had to hire somebody to do her yard work, because that's upper class. But in order for her to hire somebody, she had to do without food. It didn't make any sense to me. I guess that's why she was seeing me as a counselor. But it's interesting about social classes. Here's another thing that we tend to forget. Social class, we put up barriers. We call it in-group, out-group relationships. Everybody on my side of the street's better than people on the other side. People who live in this block are better than people who live in the other block. All kinds of distinctions we tend to make about people. And some of you remember, particularly school teachers, studying little classroom exercises where people with blue eyes would be given certain privileges compared one day, and then the next day the brown-eyed youngsters. We tend to make artificial differences. We tend to see these differences, by the way, and operate on the basis of them, even though they may have no real importance. I've thought for a long time that was really the basis of prejudice, that we want to see differences and we make judgments about differences as if they have real substance. There may be no significance at all. And whether or not, for example, people with no hair compared to people with lots of hair, people with their own teeth compared to those who have store-bought teeth. We make all kinds of differences in people. We tend to think of ourselves, and I guess that's our own integrity. We need to see ourselves as better because of some characteristics. That's social class. You're going to find it in every society. In some societies it is extremely important. The whole society operates on that basis of social classes. Well, so much for social classes. Here's another one that comes in perhaps as a little more attuned to people who are getting ready to retire. What's a retired person supposed to do? That's a question. Retired people have many choices, but a lot of them don't know how to make their choices. We ought to retire to something, not from work. From time to time we see people who suddenly find out what the sociologists have been calling the roleless roll. Once you retire, you don't have anything to do. What are you supposed to do? Nothing. That's right. You don't have any obligations. In the sense of going to work, having a certain job, having substance in the day to do certain things at a certain time, you suddenly remove all those obligations. Some people find that stressful. Being retired for some people is a roleless roll. Roleless meaning there is no set of expected behaviors. People do not have obligations. Freedom, but they don't know what to do with the freedom. And so a lot of them start to, they talk about going fishing, playing golf, things like that. Well, up here, the golf gets a little rough in the middle of the winter. I guess fishing does too, except for the people who go ice fishing. Bless their hearts, I don't know how they do it, but good for people. But anyway, retirement is not a crisis for most people. I've heard people argue about it. Well, when people retire, they die very soon. No, they don't. The evidence shows that's not true. The people who retire are typically older, and older people, percentage-wise, are going to die sooner than young people. For example, when I retired, I was given a piece of paper, and I guess it was important. It said I had 16 years of life expectancy. Well, great. 16 years. Meaning, on average, half the people at my age at the time of retirement would be dead in 16 years. Half of them wouldn't be. Well, for some people that's frightening to think, gosh, I only have 10 more years left, or, I'm supposed to die. Well, I had it figured out one time. Some federal health agency did a survey. And at the end of the survey, they wrote me back and said I was supposed to die on February something. I forgot now what year it was. I guess it wasn't important. But they had it figured out that I was supposed to die by a certain time, according to, my blood pressure and what all I did. But retirement for some people ends when they can no longer make choices. See, as long as we can make choices for ourselves, we're in control of our own lives. When we no longer can make choices, retirement's over. What happens then? Somebody else is taking care of us. Has to, because we've no longer the options. When should people start thinking about retirement? Well, I think about 15 years in advance. They need to think about 3/4 of their income, not a half. 3/4 of their income before retirement, what they're going to need afterwards. I think they need to practice a little bit. Go look around, see where they want to live, what they want to do. Practice doing these things a while and see what they like. What physical condition is the person in? It's a good time to get a general health survey of yourself. 15 years before you think about retirement, you can correct most of the problems that might be found. If you wait till after retirement, you may not have the health benefits you had while you were working. It may cost you a great deal more. Sure, you might have Medicare. On the other hand, you may not be 65. So, do it well in advance. Get in good physical condition. And thinking about retirement? Sure. Some people retire 2 or 3 times. They change jobs, they do different things, they have fun in life. That's what I recommend. Until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. Have a good one.